Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Revenera. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. We're going to try to address those as they come in, so feel free to send them in at your own pace. I'll also point your attention to the right side of the screen where you'll find the chat tab. And this is where we want you to engage with your fellow audience members, let us know your thoughts, and you might just influence our discussion today. We also do have a handout available for you under the Handouts tab, so feel free to download that to aid in today's information. And before we close out, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around till the very end. So our topic today is building a successful open source program office. And joining me is Alex Rybak, Senior Director of Product Management at Revenera, Ria Farrell-Shalnat, Open Source Compliance Manager at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And joining us momentarily due to some slight technical difficulties, we have David Kuka, Free and Open Source Software Program Manager at Bank of America. So Ria, Alex, and soon to be David, thank you all so much for joining me. Alex, do you want to get us kicked off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And if you could just share the slides here. Okay, so thank you, Cody, and thank you everybody for joining us. So we do have a good topic today, talking about how to set up an OSPO. We'll talk about some challenges, we talk about some tips and kind of best practices on how to do so. Before we do that, I do want to give each of us an opportunity to introduce ourselves. And as mentioned, David did have some issues coming on, so we will make this a 2-person pod. And if he's able to join, then he will join us in flight. So Ria, I'll let you start off by introducing yourself.
Hi, thanks for including me. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion today. As the moderator mentioned, I am Ria Farrell-Shalnat. I'm the Open Source Compliance Manager at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, although I'm representing my personal viewpoints on OSPOs today. And I am excited to be part of this discussion. I started out as a computer programmer, became a lawyer, and did that for about 20 years at a variety of different places, law firms, small companies, big companies. And now I've moved over to the business side to be part of an OSPO, which is really exciting for me. So looking forward to your questions and the discussion today.
Great, thank you, Ria. Really appreciate you joining today. So I'm Alex Rybak. I'm the Senior Director of Product Management at Revenera. I've got over 15 years of experience working with open source in various capacities. In fact, I still recall back in the early 2000s and my past life working for a startup where suddenly I was pulled into a room to look at the LGPL, having no idea what it was. And that was kind of my first introduction to this, looking at a license, trying to understand what the rules were under which we could use a particular component. So my experience dates back several years in this. I am also heading up our open source program office at Revenera, and I'm also part of our cybersecurity team. So you'll see as we go through the topics here, these things are all tightly connected. It's great to have your security folks and your legal folks and your open source folks, procurement, everybody in concert and everybody being aware of what the others are doing. So we'll get into all these topics as we go forward. And looks like David was able to join us. So go ahead, David, and please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. It's been an interesting day already. With a quick reboot, Microsoft decided to apply a bunch of updates right before this, so I'm hoping for the best. But my name's David Shuka. I am Foss Program Manager at Bank of America, and similar to Ria, I'm representing my own viewpoints here. I've been running an open source program there for about 15 years, and happy to talk about things that I think about with respect to open source.
Okay, fantastic. So the one good thing I will follow up is that when you typically start talking about OSPOs, you get people with very varied backgrounds, which is great, right? You don't want all developers or only legal or only security. You want folks that have a variety of backgrounds because all the skill sets are really required to do a good job with the program. So we're lucky to have that represented here. Okay, so here's what we are going to do today. We're going to focus on 5 topics. So we'll start off by talking about the drivers to setting up an open source program office. Why do you do it? What are the internal, external forces? How it's different from other types of processes in-house. We'll talk about some of the challenges, both challenges we've individually faced in our career, as well as just things that are typically talked about as challenges to starting an initiative as big as an OSPO. Then we'll get into OSPO elements. So what are the things, kind of what's your checklist if you're going to set up an OSPO, or if you're coming into an existing OSPO, what is your checklist of things to consider to give it the best chance for success? Then we've got a short section on tips, any sort of battle scars, anything that we can communicate to you to save you the troubles we've seen in our career in the past. And then finally, probably the most important topic is, how do you measure success? How do you know that your OSPO is working? What do you do if it isn't? How do you adjust and change course? So we'll go through these topics. This is going to be fairly casual. So let's go ahead and jump into our first topic then. So OSPO drivers. So let's, I guess, start off by talking about, well, why would somebody establish an open source program office? What are some of the internal reasons to do it, and what are maybe some of the external forces that would drive a company to do so? So, Rhea, you want to get us started?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, open source licenses that apply to any open source components, programs, etc., have certain obligations associated with them, and those obligations and fulfilling those obligations are the reason you get to use that code, and that you have the ability to modify it, that you have the ability to distribute it, whatever those permissions are that are granted via that license. And if you are not abiding by those, then you don't have a right to use that code or that component. So from the get-go, you have to be concerned about making sure you are using the software that you are gaining through that open source license properly, and that you have a program in place to make sure that compliance is adhered to. But I think that is fundamental to all of those open source licenses. But in more recent years, cybersecurity has become a real concern for any use of software, including open source. And since open source underlies an awful lot of the computer products out there, the security departments of companies and of programmers using these types of components is necessary to ensure that you don't either consume something that is problematic, or that you don't deliver something to a downstream customer that is problematic. So being able to evaluate and keep track of vulnerabilities as they come out is super important. And then finally, sustainability is the third area that I think is incredibly important to open source today. And that means that you might have an open source component that is being maintained by a single programmer. That if you're not familiar with it, look at the XKCD cartoon 2347. It captures in a perfect nutshell the problem with sustainability in open source, that if one person or a small group of people is maintaining a particular project, what happens if they all win the lotto and decide to retire to Aruba and no longer work on that code? Or what happens if they get a different job and they just don't have time to monitor pull requests anymore? Those type of things can happen. And so for the sustainability of software that you critically rely upon, you need to be thinking about those issues.
Excellent. Thank you. David, anything you want to add to that? Okay, so it looks like David's screen's freezing up a bit. So let me throw in a few thoughts, and we'll come back to David. So I guess the first thing I would say is, what is an OSPO, right? So to me, an OSPO is just, it's similar to a program management office, right? Where if you have a complicated project that's going to be dealing with lots of different aspects of your company, it's going to be folks from different functions, right? As a cross-functional team, you need an overarching framework to be able to support the project, to manage the project plan, to manage milestones, and manage delivering the results of the project. So an OSPO is similar to that, focused on both consumption and contribution to open source. How much or how little of the OSPO is implemented is really up to the organization and whatever they need to be able to accomplish. But essentially, it supports operationalizing the open source strategy of an organization, or if they don't have one, developing the strategy and then operationalizing it. When I look at OSPOs, it typically is the framework under which you're going to decide how you want to consistently consume open source, because today everybody's consuming it. Every time, I've got a kind of full disclosure, so I do work for Revenera. We do create software composition analysis products that help customers scan and understand open source of their products. So I come from that perspective, and every time we do so, we find people are using open source. So the fact that consumption is happening is kind of a given. So how do you best manage it? How do you become consistent in your use? How do you make sure you comply with obligations that Ria mentioned? How do you make sure that each team is trained and understanding what they need to do? That is the function of the Open Source Program Office, to help enable success in all of those areas. So David, wanted to hand it over to you as well. Okay, so I think it's having some audio issues. Okay, so I guess let's talk a little bit about what's the difference between an OSPO, for example, and an open source review board, right? So I will start here, and then I'll let Ria comment on that. So we typically see OSPO being a bit of a progression. Typically, when an OSPO is set up, what you see is there's lots of activity happening team to team, but it's happening siloed, right? Teams may not know what each other's doing. Teams may be independently scanning. They may have varying policies. So an OSPO helps to bring everything together. And typically, what I've seen is you may start with something called an open source review board, which is essentially focused on how do we properly consume open source, right? What is our policy for use? How do we scan? How do we review? How do we remediate? And it's really bounded to just the intake part of open source. Then we see organizations mature beyond that, and when they start talking about both consumption and contribution, you may see an open source program office, right? So that's one path that we've seen in the past. And at that point, you have more of an overarching agenda there, where you're dealing with not just consumption, but how do you become a good citizen of the open source community? How do you drive adoption? How do you participate in different open source communities? So I'll kick it over to Ria. Do you want to comment on kind of the distinction between a full-blown open source program office and what somebody may do as a stepping stone to getting there?
Sure. I think a lot of it depends on the resources that are available to a given company. So it could be as small as a single person doing the lifting and being a gatekeeper, if you will, on compliance issues, to something much more strategic. It really depends. I think the labels are less important, whether you call it an OSPO or an OSRB or compliance office, whatever you call it, is less important than what the scope of the duties are under it. I would tend to agree that most companies are looking to control risk at some level. And so that tends to be the entry level to get sign on to say, hey, there is a risk component here. We need to manage that risk. Therefore, we need some resources dedicated to looking at this. If you go past that point and you get comfortable with the risk and you start to develop policies where you reach that level of comfort, then certainly you can expand into considering things like things beyond consumption, whether that's contribution or leadership, getting involved in the larger open source ecosystem, whether that's joining groups under the Linux Foundation or potentially joining groups that are available with Slack channels, or working groups that are dedicated to that, or working groups around a specific project. All of those things are available as the journey continues.
All right. Thank you, Ria. I think David's back with us. So.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. You're good.
Yeah. Totally switched out to Android. I wanted to kind of comment on that. I kind of think of it similar to the CMM model, the capability maturity model, where starting out ad hoc, right? You might do something or nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. And then as you progress, kind of like Ria was saying, you might manage the license risk first. You might manage, security risk, operational risk, but eventually you get to a point where it's like, yeah, I want to contribute. And those outgoing contributions, by the way, are just as important to focus on and something to, there are a lot of risks, paramount in that as well. And then tying it all together, we were talking a while ago about monitoring and metrics. And just like with CMM level 5, for example, it's a metrics feedback system. You want to keep track of what you're doing. And, as you go through that, progress through and become more mature, make sure that you evolve whatever it is you're doing, whatever you're tracking along with that. So very much in line with that.
Okay, perfect. So next area I really wanted to cover is some of the external forces, right? So certainly there's the internal push for mitigating risk and getting ahead of, making sure that you're complying with licenses and so forth. But there's also external forces, right? We've got the executive order from Biden administration from last May. We've got lots of industry groups, essentially anything that can harm, right? We're talking vehicles, we're talking airplanes, we're talking medical devices. They all have some language around IT controls, around cybersecurity controls. We hear the term software bill of material or SBOM. That's kind of the buzzword of 21 and 22. How do these things feed into OSPO, right? Do you guys want to talk a little bit about how are these external forces causing companies to react and to best be able to address those needs, potentially through setting up an open source program office? David, I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah. And when the executive order came out and everybody's like, SBOM, oh my God, we need an SBOM. Where are we going to get an SBOM? Let's get one today. My question is around that is, well, what do you want to do with that SBOM? And that really goes back to, what do you actually do? There are, I mentioned CMM earlier, but there's ISO 9000, there's the FFIEC. What drives your industry? What drives what you deliver? Are you primarily internal? Are you external? Are you delivering software? What I think about is, what is it that you actually do? Because when you start talking about software coming in and software going out, that's where an SBOM can really help you. So understanding what you do and what you deliver is probably the most important thing, because you can't, otherwise you're just kind of, probably just kind of flailing around looking, it's like, oh, let's just add something in. It's information, but without any purpose. And so understand what you do and integrate into that.
I think a key thing about this too is that the way programming is done today with package managers and containers and ISOs, you're pulling in things that you may not fully understand what you're pulling in. And it's not like when I started out in computer programming, I knew exactly which components I was choosing to link in. I might have a library that I was pulling in with, submodules in it. But I had a lot of control and a lot of understanding of what it was that I was utilizing. And that was back in the day of almost monolithic programming. So it was something where you had less modularization, but then today programming is almost a little bit like herding cats. I think that you've got you pull out a program package manager, and now you've got 1,000 modules, or you've got sub modules under that. And if you don't have some way to when you're consuming those materials, to understand what they are and highlight that, then it's going to be really difficult for you to assess what kind of risks you really have.
Okay, completely agreed. And I do think another thing to consider is, typically companies have fairly mature processes to bring in commercial off-the-shelf software, right? Procurement gets involved, legal gets involved, there's contracts, there's payment. So these things kind of flow nicely through the company. Open source is different. It hasn't traditionally gone through those channels. So open source does need to have the same level of oversight and management. It's not intrinsically any better or worse. It's just been managed differently. So an open source program office helps, again, put a framework in place to get as many eyeballs and processes in place for taking in open source as you would with traditional commercial software.
That's a great point, Alex, because you wouldn't be licensing in proprietary software without some kind of program or some kind of mechanism in place to understand what is it I've licensed in, when do those licenses expire, do I have a certain number of seats available to me to use so I don't go over that, Am I consuming on a model where I have additional costs associated with the number of licenses I'm consuming? Therefore, I need to pay somebody, and you have all of those mechanisms already with proprietary software. And I think maybe sometimes open source companies can look at that and say, oh, well, it's a panacea. I don't have to pay for licenses. I don't have to pay for seats. I can freely distribute and modify this stuff. But that would be a mistake, because there are obligations and you have to pay attention to those obligations.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what you said earlier, Ria, about licenses. And one of the things that people will say about free software is like, oh, I don't need a license. Completely 100% wrong. You absolutely do need a license. The license is the only thing that grants you permission to use that software. And with respect to procurement, somebody's reading the licenses and negotiating a contract with open source. And maybe this goes back to what's the best way to get it started? Start reading those licenses. Somebody's got to read the license for everything that's coming in to make sure that you are aware of the risks, you are aware of the obligations, and that you comply with the obligations. If you don't comply with the obligations, then you lose your right to use that software. And Ria, I don't know if you want to comment on what happens in those cases, but I believe it's copyright infringement at that point.
It could be copyright infringement. You even have to be concerned about potential patent issues with, if you're using particular pieces of software and you don't know what other people might have patent protection on. But I think it doesn't have to be a scary thing. There are tons and tons of resources out there for people, especially if you're just getting started. There's conferences you can go to deep dive into this stuff. There are Slack channels. There's the To-Do Slack channel, which stands for Talk Opening, Develop Opening. It's an OSPO dedicated channel that it's very friendly. They even have resources, and I think they have a new thing that you can type newbie when you join that Slack channel, and it will sort of direct you to where you can go. There's Linux Foundation has tons and tons of free courses that you can leverage and access to get up to speed. And then there's reams and reams of articles that have been written by attorneys and technologists, and FAQs that are available, say, on the FSF website. There are so many resources available to you to help kind of deconstruct what these licenses mean and which ones that you may have more or less tolerance for, so that you can start getting a handle on this. You don't have to feel like you've got to start from scratch and figure it out all by yourself.
Perfect. Okay, so let's switch over to challenges. So now that we kind of understand a little bit of the drivers that push organizations to consider starting an OSPO, let's talk about challenges. So typically, there's really two use cases, right? Either you're starting a new one, I guess three. One is you're starting a new one. Two is you've got pockets of individual OSPOs at different business units, and you're trying to create a corporate one that pulls everybody together, or you're kind of injected into an existing one because you join an organization that has one in place. So you guys care to kind of share your experiences with what are some of the challenges? What are some of the first things? I remember, Ria, you did mention training. Certainly that's an important one. But where would you start? What are things to kind of some of the landmines to look out for when you're getting going?
Well, I'm a big fan of education. Education, I think, is the fundamental number one thing that you need to get it into the water. It's, if you have one person in your company who's responsible for handling all of this stuff, and they're kind of fighting the fight in a lone sort of way, that's a lot of burden for one person to consume. But if you can federate it out and kind of many hands make light work, I'm a big believer in that. Through training, and I've done trainings that are as simple as 10-minute long trainings. It's not a heavy lift, but it at least gets into the water that this exists. There's obligations associated with it, and here are some of the benefits that engaging with open source, whether you're on a consumption model or on a contribution model or somewhere in between, or a hybrid version of that, that you can use to sell to your managers and up the chain in your company to get recognition for the benefits that open source have, and get more support for having people assigned to helping you work on that. David, I think you wanted to say something too.
Yeah, I was going to say understanding the size and education and communication were the two things that we're talking about. And the communication, here's what's going on. But really, it's, depends on the size and complexity of your organization. Conway's Law comes to mind as well. But if you're creating something new, I mean, think about it as, running, you should have a project manager, run it as a project, make sure you've got funding, make sure you got staff, equipment, and so on and so forth. But if you're a very small organization, something grassroots might be very appropriate for you. So I think, again, go back and figure out, what's the right way to roll something across your company, because it is something that is, it covers, it impacts your entire, it really does impact your entire organization. So coming up with something, some sort of an umbrella, an umbrella policy or, procedures or whatever for the entire company is probably where you want to end up. But the individual path to get there might, it might be a very strange path for your company, but hopefully, a project manager would keep that all organized.
Yeah, and one of the challenges I personally had was just understanding what's in place when you start, right? So typically, no company does everything, no company does nothing, right? There's something happening. There's teams independently kind of bottom-up scanning. There's teams who think that they have a policy, or maybe they have an old policy that newer teams aren't aware of. There may have been lots of M&A in the past where different elements of policies have come in. So I think one challenge I've had, and one thing I would definitely recommend people focus on, is kind of do an assessment of where you are today. Try to retain as much as you can of what teams are doing, because chances are they've been disrupted before, they adopted some sort of process. So as much as you can keep that going and maybe build on top of that, and maybe have these teams evangelize to their peers, that can all be beneficial, because this is fairly disruptive. Developers have a very difficult job these days, right? They're not just writing code, they're responsible for compliance, they're responsible for scanning, they're responsible for security. That's a lot, right? That's 3 full-time jobs right there. So you're going to add a 4th to them. So, kind of go slow, be mindful of the fact that this will take people off of what their day jobs are in some capacity. So yes, I definitely piggyback off training. I definitely piggyback off the idea that not just training about what to do, but why it's important and what the benefits are, because there are a lot of benefits, starting with minimizing remediation in the future. Right? That's another disruptive task. So focus on what's in it for the people that you're asking to help, and focus on how it will make the organization better and better able to respond to any sort of external requests for information, or SBOMs, or security reports, or anything else that the OSPO would facilitate.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. It's like if you roll something out as a tax on developers, that tends to be met with, I think, resistance. That what's in it for me is definitely something to to focus on and connect, and a connection point for your developers.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about who should be part of OSPO. Clearly, development team has to be involved because they're the ones touching the code. But what other functions are really critical to be part of OSPO? David, do you want to start?
I'm going to throw out legal there, because Ria, that would be a conflict of interest for you to say legal has to be involved. Legal and your development team, obviously, security, your project management team, honestly, might be easier to think about who should not be involved. And that might just be marketing. But then again, marketing might be involved. It depends, again, on what you do. So it's pretty broad.
See, I think cross-functionalization is incredibly important, and you hit some of the big ones. Having legal involved, having security involved, making sure that the product team is involved. Those go almost without saying. But I think I would counter that the marketing does need to be involved, because it's part of people understanding, that you're paying attention to open source, that maybe, especially if you're engaged in a contribution or a leadership model, that becomes part of your marketing platform. And you also, one of the unique things about open source licenses is, while many of them will have at least a copyright license, and some even have explicit patent licenses, one thing you typically do not see in open source licenses is a trademark license. So you need to be conscious of the fact that you need to be using those components and whatever identity is associated with them respectfully, and that you're not leveraging somebody else's trademark inappropriately. And so having marketing involved and having both marketing and the legal department that's engaged in trademarks, if you have that type of a department, I think they're really critical resources to include.
Yeah, and going back to, depends on what you do. And there, you mentioned the trademark. Some of them prevent you from using their trademark. Like the BSD class licenses will say you can't do it, and then the Creative Commons attribution license where you have to say what you do it. Kind of. There's some licenses say you have to, some say you can't do it. And it kind of goes back to the legal and understanding the legal parts of it as well. But but those licenses, but I agree, marketing definitely, pretty much everybody. I think we are in pretty much everybody at that point.
I'd even argue get involved with HR, because I think open source is really critical for both the retention of your talent as well as the recruitment of your talent.
Agreed.
Given that open source underlies, I mean, I've seen quotes that, say, 90% of the world's software engages open source, and, some projects, comprise, a given proprietary project might have 75% open source in it, or whatever it is. If you want to attract developers and attract people who understand how to work on this stuff and aren't afraid to, get their hands dirty and dig in and understand and know how to interact with those communities, you want to get them into your company. But if you have a policy that doesn't promote that open source, you may have trouble attracting the type of people that you want to work on your software.
Yeah, and I would even further expand the circle sales, for example, right? And pre-sales, very often there's lots of questions around, well, how do you ensure quality in your product, right? What processes do you use? So organizations like OpenChain, which is kind of a specification on how to properly manage open source. All of these things are really helpful to not get into a 20-minute conversation explaining what you do. Having an open source program office, having OpenChain conformant program immediately confers that there's trustworthiness in what you do. So it's important from the sales side. Certainly important from product management, right? I've got to represent kind of my side of the house. You're going to disrupt roadmaps. I mean, it's inevitable. It's going to happen, because whenever you set up an open source program office, you're going to have scanning, you're going to have remediation work, you're going to have timelines. So you need to have the product managers be in the fold, understand the value, understand that it's just as important as fixing a critical security vulnerability, and they're going to need to make room in the backlog to address whatever findings come out of this process. The first time you go through your code, there's going to be lots of surprises, right? And you have to expect that. So there will be disruption to engineering, there will be disruption to roadmap plans, there will be disruption to marketing plans. So every one of those stakeholders needs to be involved to understand that and to buy into it, because it has to be a culture change. It can't just be kind of a top-down forced initiative. It has to be something that people buy into. How about how to get started, right? Like if you have nothing in place and you don't know what people are doing, where's the best place to go to kind of get going, right? Do you start with legal and kind of understand what legal has imposed as far as a policy? Do you start with your security team? Where's kind of the best place to go if you're really going greenfield and starting from scratch?
I think originally I would have said legal to start with, because it's the easiest sell in terms of the risk compliance aspect. But given the executive SBOM order, I'm almost leaning towards security these days, because this is a fundamental part of being able to sell your products and sell your services and include that open source in those things if you're selling to the government. And ultimately, I think this is something that's going to ripple across not just the US government, but private enterprise, because at some point in your supply chain, and you mentioned OpenChain, but at some point in the journey, someone is going to be selling products or services to the government. And so they're going to insist on having that SBOM so that they can pass that along down the line. So eventually it's just something that's going to be required, I think, across the board. And then other countries are also picking up on this as well. And so it's going to be an international thing. If you don't have that SBOM and you don't have a security department that's clued into creating that SBOM, appropriately to track those vulnerabilities, then that seems to be I think that's maybe the most compelling place to start today.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to pick license and legal risk over vulnerability risk. You could argue one's more sometimes vulnerabilities get more visibility because the impact of that tends to get a lot of press and could take your system down and whatnot. But really, I think you need balance between. I wouldn't try to focus on one or the other. I would try to bring them both in at the same time and just maintain a balanced balance that rhythm.
That's a great point. I mean, getting both a stakeholder from security, a stakeholder from legal, and stakeholder from your product development department, that might be the best way to create a company setup.
If you want to start today, Alex, just go read a license.
There you go.
If you haven't read one yet, read them all.
Yeah, and Rhea did mention the executive order a couple of days ago. Could you mute on your end? So a couple of days ago, the U.S. government announced that they are actually starting up an OSPO themselves. Right, they're calling it the Open Source Coordination Office, but essentially it is a centralized team that will deal with policy training, tradecraft around open source intelligence. Right, so that's kind of the conclusion of all the work that's happened over the last year around the executive order, coming up with processes, best practices, procedures that will culminate in an official office, either located in the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, or potentially as part of the Office of the CTO. Right, so in the future, pretty much everybody who's building software, as Rhea mentioned, ultimately does trickle to the U.S. government or trickles into an industry that is heavily regulated, and having a set of procedures to kind of guarantee and provide transparency and trustworthiness into whatever process you follow is going to be critically important. Okay, so let's talk about open source program office elements. Right, so typically when we talk about an OSPO, kind of run down the list and then we can discuss them. So certainly you need program objectives. Right, you need to understand why you set it up. You need to understand what the charter is. Right, you need to understand what the goals are of the open source program office. You need to have roles, responsibilities. Right, you need to understand who's involved, what their jobs are, what they're accountable for, and that needs to be a big part of the training, is to set up people to succeed. Right, you can't expect developers to create better security and applications without providing them training and setting the right expectation on what they're being asked to do. You certainly need policies, right? And hopefully your policies cover various use cases, right? How do we ingest open source? How do we contribute? Policies may be different. There's different levels of risk there. What do we do for hosted applications versus distributed applications versus internal applications? How often do we scan? How deep do we scan? What are our SLAs around remediation, right? How quickly do we have to fix a critical vulnerability versus a licensing issue, right? These are all things that need to be written down. They can't be left for interpretation. They need to be written down into a policy, and hopefully you're using solutions out there where the policy can be encoded into the product and take lots of manual work out of the process. You need to talk about compliance artifacts. How are you going to produce them? Right? How are you going to build an SBOM? What goes into your SBOM? How often do you refresh your SBOM? How do you deliver it to somebody? What do you do around security reports, right? What happens if a customer asks for, give me your latest pen test result, or give me your list of known vulnerabilities and your comments on when they're going to be fixed, right? These are things that hopefully you're proactively putting in place through the OSPO, as opposed to having fire drills every time that somebody may ask. What do you do around third-party notices, right? How do you provide attribution? How do you comply with attribution requirements from licenses? How do you do it in kind of the least burdensome way? Because that's typically a fairly difficult process to follow. And how often do you refresh these, right? What do you do around incident response? So what happens when a customer calls and says, hey, we found a vulnerability in your product, or a third-party security researcher is able to exploit your product? What do you do? Who runs point? How does your communication work? What did you do when Log4j hit? Those are the types of things that hopefully you've got documented procedures so that it doesn't become reactive, but you've got plans and you don't disrupt lots of teams to be able to respond to that. Training, right? Huge part, probably number one. What's part of your training program? You have to talk about licenses. You've got to talk about vulnerabilities. You've got to talk about what the function of the OSPO is, what people are being asked to do. So your training program needs to be lots of small pieces, not an overwhelming 8-hour block, right? Because people aren't going to retain much. And you want to make it kind of organic, right? You want to make it part of your team culture. So lots of kind of train the trainers. There's lots of training available from Linux Foundation, from various locations. I saw somebody posted a link to the to-do group. Lots of great content there around setting up an OSPO, checklists, guides, descriptions of different functions. So there's lots of content available out there. And then finally, accountability, right? You need to have a statement on accountability. Are you the police as an OSPO? Are you an advisory team, which is just merely providing information and each team operates autonomously on compliance? You need to talk through these and understand what works best for your organization. And you need to be clear on it, right? If engineering is responsible for something and they're being scored on it as part of their annual reviews, well, they need to know that, right? You can't make it a surprise. So accountability and kind of understanding how much of the accountability sits with the OSPO versus individual teams is important and needs to be explained as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and let our panelists comment on these or anything that I may have missed as far as the OSPO elements go. So,
well, that was pretty comprehensive.
I agree. I would add one other thing, and which we talked about a little bit, which is measuring what you're doing. And we talked about measuring success. I know if I'm successful, but maybe it's not even necessarily about what success is, because that can change. But at least measuring activity. How many open source elements are coming in, how many are going out, different licenses that and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to have some sort of measurement in there, just so you understand what the activity. Especially, there's a dramatic change in that activity. All of a sudden, we're consuming twice as much open source. All of a sudden, we're consuming half as much open source. And then the ability and the time to go back and think about and try to explain when and why did it happen. So I would add that, Alex.
Yep, and that's kind of perfect segue to the last topic, which is measuring success. So
before you dive into that, I'll add one other that I was thinking about. And while it is super important to understand all of those things, and I'll give a +1 to both Alex and David there, one project that I'm particularly interested in lately is the Chaos project that focuses on community help, open source and sustainability issues that will look at the health of the project. Is it a project that has lots of contributors to it? Is it a project that is managed by a individual? Is it a project that's managed by a corporation? Is it a project that's managed by a foundation? To give you a sense of what kind of support exists for it. Does it have a lot of GitHub stars? So is this a project that's being utilized extensively in the broader industry ecosystem, so that you can know that it has that 1,000 eyeballs that open source promises? Those are really, really important components to consider as you're delivering software, because just because it works today and you manage to package up and you make your deliverable deadline, great, good for you. But what happens if one of those components isn't available in the future, or that it is not keeping pace with the development in a particular area? Those are things to think about strategically that are super important as well.
Yep, and I completely agree with Ria's point, and I want to give a little bit of context to it. So there's a difference if you're creating a cloud product that releases weekly and you have the ability to react to a disruption, versus if you're building a Boeing plane that's going to be in service for 50 years, right? And you have to understand kind of what is the nature of what you're building and the nature of the relative importance of open source to your business, and what happens if a set of components that you rely on go away, right? What happens, as Ria mentioned, somebody goes on vacation, they change jobs, they stop contributing, the project dies off in contributions. How easy is it for you to react to that? How easy is it for you to switch out the technology? And the more difficult it is, the more you really want to support those organizations and at least have a deep understanding of where your code's coming from, because you may not be able to, switch the operating system in an airplane overnight, right? It may take years to do it or decades to do it. So you really have, those are the cases where switching from simply ingestion to influence and support and contribution and engagement with the community becomes really important. Okay. So the last
Sorry,
topic we wanted to cover.
Alex,
Yeah,
I was
right
trying to come off mute. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, building something like that into your risk model. We didn't go into risk model a whole lot, but clear build out some more sort of model or set of attributes around what constitutes a good open source usage for you versus not a good open source usage. And I think that's where that fits in, and I think that goes along with that maturity. The open source community has matured as well. 10 years ago, the quality of software in open source has just grown dramatically. And like Apache is very regimented after development type of approach, versus but anybody can just put something out there on GitHub as well. So having the awareness of that and being and distinguishing between those things, but into your model to reflect your tolerance for those types of things, and I think that works well too.
Absolutely. Okay. Final thing, and David did mention it a little bit around metrics, right? Critical to both measure success, but also just measure velocity, measure discrete changes, measure kind of unexpected events. So To Do Group has lots of great content around some of the metrics to use. There's kind of three buckets I like to look at. So number one is your use of open source, right? How well is an organization managing compliance, right? How many legal remediation tasks do you have? Are you able to produce notices for all your products? Are you able to clean up licenses where you may not have used them properly or you may not have complied with obligations? How does your velocity look for remediation over time? Are the number of issues growing as you scan more? Are you converging and closing faster than you find? So very similar to what a QA team would do on defects in the product, you've got to look at kind of the same perspective on open source use. What are your overall remediation trends, right? Are you able to act faster over time, which means your processes are kind of getting smoothed out and people are getting better at their functions? Or is your remediation taking longer because maybe you've got all the low-hanging fruit now are the really complicated cases that take a long time to fix? Certainly, each remediation task will not be equal, right? Replacing an infrastructure piece in a legacy project is going to take a lot more time than replacing a calendar widget in a front-end application. So you have to be mindful of that. And kind of most importantly, and what matters to the outside is how quickly and how are you able to produce compliance artifacts? Can you produce SBOMs on a regular cadence? Are they complete? Are they accurate? Can you properly produce notices? Can you produce security reports? Can you produce third-party source bundles as you're required to by certain licenses? So measuring your ability to kind of get into a groove and do this continuously through whatever metrics are relevant to your organization is very important, right? That just measures whether your program is working. And then there's the other side of the house, which is the contribution measurements, right? Or if this is part of the context of your OSPO, are your developers participating to a level of influence that you want for external projects? How's your reputation in the open source community, right? If you really want to become a participant, you should have some goals around, we want to be viewed as XYZ and measure that over time. What is the overall health of your own projects that you put out there, right? If you have open source code out there, is somebody measuring the code for you, right? And are you measuring it yourself? And then I think Rhea mentioned the HR point is, how's your ability to recruit, right? There's lots of developers graduating from school today that want to be engaged in open source, and they typically want to go to companies that have processes in place, right? Where it's not kind of anarchy and ad hoc, but there is kind of an incubation of this, the open source community, as well as overarching process to help them with proper consumption and contribution. So those are kind of the overall areas. I'll open it up to Rhea and Dave on any specifics they want to add to it.
I think you did cover the metrics pretty. We've talked. We hit on. I think you covered it pretty well. Again, it depends on your organization. I'll just kind of reiterate your organization, your goals, and your model for what's acceptable. But it's just really important to start from set in mind. You've got to know what you're doing, and make sure that your program is staying healthy in that regard. Yeah, and then also the ability to evolve those metrics, those measurements into spaces. If you just start out reading licenses, maybe you just do volumes, maybe you assess some sort of a number to it, but just volumes is probably, if you want to keep it simple, just count things to start with. And then a lot of times it'll be clear, we should look, what's the next question? Let's ask that question. Oh, now we can answer that using these numbers.
I think the other part that's important is we've hit a lot on compliance in this talk and why compliance is so important, and it absolutely is. I mean, it's kind of right out of the gate, whether it's security compliance or license compliance, but maybe we've been a little bit lighter on the benefits that open source offers and how open source not only reduces your lead time on project or service generation, it keeps you from reinventing the wheel and doing things that have already been done before and maybe are not as interesting. You can go to the next level because you've already got that base out there. And being able to sell that component into the management of the company, while Alex mentioned it cannot be a top-down, just sort of regimented, you must do this or else kind of thing, because I don't think anybody gets excited about those type of mandates. But getting people excited about where you can take your product, your service, your company by leveraging open source, that becomes not just risk mitigation, but it becomes something exciting that all the way up to the executive office can get behind and understand how this can actually benefit them and benefit them from a marketing standpoint, from a strategic development standpoint, from a deliverable and making deadline standpoint, because while it does have to be in the roadmap to do that open source compliance and remediation if necessary, your roadmap is going to be accelerated because you're using open source. So there's a symbiotic nature to the whole thing.
I just wanted to echo that. I had to laugh, Rhea, because I was going to say, let's not. We talked about a lot of risks and a lot of scary things, and let's not forget benefits. And I think you summarized that nicely. And one of the questions, if you wanted to, do you want to use that? Yes or no. It's a choice, right? It's that you make, your organization makes. No one's forcing you to use open source, but the benefit is if you don't want to use the open source, be prepared to write them yourself. And there's a certain amount of risk that comes in with doing both, right? The open source one might be a lot better than what you guys, what your team can get pulled together in a week or a month. And I think the timing one, that the aspect that you mentioned, time to market, reuse of solutions that are already developed, open source really. I mean, if how much software is new stuff every day, and as we said, 90% open source embedded in those things. It's really kind of an amazing time if you look at how things have changed over 10 or 15 years. The speed and the quality are just they continue to go up. But anyway, I just had to laugh. Definitely important.
Yeah, I think I'll kind of close with 2 points. So I think number one, you're almost at a competitive disadvantage if you don't use open source, because all your competitors are using it. You're just going to be slower to market. So it's kind of a no-brainer at this point. But also from a recruitment and retention perspective, nobody's looking to get development working on logging technology, right? Or working on kind of low-level component functionality. People want to innovate. They want to work on kind of cool, new, exciting things, and open source allows you to kind of start with a baseline of develop with lots of eyeballs and lots of testing and quick responses to issues, and focus on really the core competence of your individual products. So definitely something to consider. Okay, so I wanted to thank all of you. I know we've got a few questions here, so let's go hit a few questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. So there's a question here. So again, I work for Venera. We're in the SCA market, so I'll kind of give an answer to this question, but just be mindful of my context on this. So there's a question around, we use Black Duck to scan for open source. What are some other scanners out there? There's a ton of scanners. There's lots of open source scanners that are great. There's lots of commercial vendors that have scanners. I would say understand what you're trying to achieve with whatever scanner or scanners you pick, right? If you're looking to do deep dives where you understand every fragment of code, that's something that Revenera does. If you're looking for adoption of open source technologies and integrate with lots of other products, there's lots of different scanners out there. So I would say before you kind of pick one, really understand what you want to get out of the scan process. Do you have people to look at results? Do you want fully automated? What's your level of risk and level of depth you need to go to? And then, talk to teams. Chances are there's lots of other teams probably using other scanners as well. I don't know if you two want to comment on that, but
I would also comment that Alex is absolutely right that you have to look at what it is you're scanning, and to David's earlier part, why are you scanning? Are you scanning so you can create that SBOM to comply with the government mandate? If that's your focus, there's a lot of different companies that are engaged in that particular focus, and I think Microsoft is planning to open source their own SBOM generation tool. There are other open source scanners available. There's one called ORT. There's another one called Turn. There's probably another dozen others that I'm not thinking of right now, but you can find those out by just doing some searching on the internet or joining the to-do group and just throwing out the question there. You'll get lots of responses. There are lots of ingestion, and you might even be able to repurpose some of what you use for tracking internal software in your build development, whether it's through Jenkins or some other build tool, to catalog what code you're bringing into an overall product build. So lots of choices there.
Yeah, I want to add to that. In the spirit of open source and everything, if you don't want to choose something, and there are some free ones out there, but grab a Unix developer and find piped into grep is the simplest scanner that you can run, and you could do that today if you wanted to, as long as you've got access to those Unix utilities.
Yeah. Oh, I even forgot to mention Fossology. Fossology was one of the early scanning tools that existed, and so that's another open source mechanism you can utilize.
All right. Well, perfect. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate you joining me today. I want to give Cody a few minutes because I know he has some wrap-up statements, and Cody, will hand it back to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you, David. And thank you, Ria, for joining us today. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that the session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So quickly, we do have those four gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Iqbal N. Our second winner is Brian W. Our third winner is Jerry K. And our fourth and final winner is Naomi J. To the four of you, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. If you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. Again, Alex, Ria, David, thank you. I would like to thank Revenera for sponsoring today's webinar. And before we leave, I'd like to also thank you, our audience. We really appreciate you spending time with us. Please just take one extra moment to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.